God versus Nature, the conflict between religion and science in history. Chapter 10. The discovery of deep time leads to the demotion of Genesis. The achievements of the scientific revolution proved the power of the rational human mind, which was now confident enough to challenge established religious dogmas. This intellectual transformation of Europe led to the Enlightenment, an era marked by a supreme confidence in the power of the rational mind together with an antipathy for superstition and dogmatism. It became increasingly acceptable to criticize faith-based Christian dogmas such as the Trinity or the role of the sacraments. Many thinkers turned to deism, the view that God created the world and then withdrew from taking an active part in it. Deists accepted the Bible's moral authority, but rejected its literal interpretation as an accurate history of the world. God had created the universal laws governing the universe, but he certainly did not tinker day to day in the world, through events such as miracles and floods. The deists saw the natural world not as a ruin of a more perfect time, but as an orderly world that is open to human achievement. In addition to the deists, there were even a few self-proclaimed atheists, such as the Baron d'Holbach and Denis Diderot, creators of the famous Encyclopédie. Enlightenment thinkers saw that modern science relied on a view of nature as being completely causal, and that the existence of miracles was a direct contradiction to this view of nature. This confidence in science led them to have scorn for the biblical stories of miracles, and to see a fundamental conflict between science and religion. The Marquis de Condorcet wrote that Christianity, quote, feared that spirit of doubt and inquiry, that confidence in one's own reason, which is the bane of all religious beliefs. The natural sciences were odious and suspect, for they are very dangerous to the success of miracles, and there is no religion that does not force its devotees to swallow a few physical absurdities. Unquote. The momentum of scientific discovery from the 17th century continued into the 18th. One relatively new science was geology. Observations of the Earth's surface often revealed rock layers containing shapes of shells and fish. These layers could have been sedimentary deposits at the bottoms of ancient seas. The shapes embedded in the rocks led to questions about how they got there, especially the animal shapes which did not correspond to any existing animals. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions had always prompted people to wonder about their causes. During the Middle Ages, many saw these as direct signs of God's anger, but now they considered possible natural causes. Numerous thinkers worked on reconciling these observations with biblical events such as the flood. As more and more of these observations were made, it started becoming obvious that the earth was much older than the 6,000 or so years that the Bible seemed to indicate. Some of the figures of the scientific revolution started making observations and starting a chain of reasoning that would eventually lead to the embrace of a very different timescale. The new timescale would truly dwarf the biblical account, since it was measured in tens of millions or even billions of years. By the time Charles Darwin started conceiving his theory of natural selection in 1838, he could be confident of the immensity of time that had elapsed in the Earth's history, an immensity of time that was a requirement for his theory of evolution. The idea of a timescale so immensely removed from our ability to grasp perceptually has been called deep time, and it is central to the science of geology. Archbishop James Ussher and the Age of the Earth. The Bible provides a narrative of interconnected events starting with the creation of the world by God in Genesis 1. Quote, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning one day." Unquote. The following verses describe the creation of the heavens on the second day, the dry land, the seas, and vegetation on the third day, the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day, the birds and the fish on the fifth day, and finally, animals and man on the sixth day. Ever since the patristic period of Christianity, biblical scholars have performed calculations based on the Bible and Jewish historical traditions to assign dates to various biblical events. In the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea assembled a chronicle based on Jewish historical traditions reaching back in time to the birth of Abraham. St. Jerome extended this chronicle back to Adam. The Protestant Reformation in Europe led to a proliferation of biblical chronologies. The most definitive and well-known calculation of the age of the world was performed by the Irish scholar and Anglican Archbishop James Ussher. Using the King James Bible as his source, Ussher added together all the ages and reigns of the kings and concluded that the world was created in 4004 BC. Further information, including astronomical tables, led him to conclude that the world was created in the evening preceding October 23 of the year 4004 BC. Ussher published his conclusion in his Annals of the World in 1650. His dates were reprinted in the margins of numerous editions of the King James Bible, starting in 1701. Many Christians considered the chronology of the world a crucial subject because they considered it a clue as to the date of the end of the world and the last judgment. Many believed that the world would last 6,000 years in total. Nicolaus Steno and the Nature of Fossils. Since antiquity, people had noted that the shapes of shells and fish could sometimes be found in rock layers which were far from the sea, and sometimes even high up in the mountains. Two competing theories had emerged as to their origins. One was that actual fish had somehow become petrified. The other view was that the fish shapes had gotten imprinted on the rocks as accidents or sports of nature. The Platonic form of fish that was intended to get into the sea had accidentally ended up in rock, causing the fish shape to grow in the rock. The first significant steps toward a rational view of the Earth's past were taken by Danish physician Niels Stensen, better known as Nicolaus Steno, 1638 to 1686. Steno attended the University of Copenhagen, where he studied anatomy. His interest in rocks came by way of his interest in the anatomy of sharks and in curiously shaped rocks known as tongue stones. Tongue stones had roughly triangular shapes and could be up to several inches in length. Most of them came from Malta, where they were dug up from the ground and sold. In Europe, they were valued for their supposed curative powers. Their powder was considered an antidote to poison. Fishermen had noted that they were shaped a lot like the teeth of sharks. Steno studied Maltese tongue stones and carefully compared them to the teeth of sharks. He noticed that specific signs of wear that were common on shark teeth also appeared on tongue stones. He concluded that the resemblance was not just approximate. The tongue stones were petrified teeth from actual sharks. These were not sports of nature. Moreover, Steno saw that a similar type of petrification could help explain the many shell and fish shapes found in layers of rock. He noted that, according to the Bible, all things had been covered by water, not just once, but twice. First at the beginning of creation, then at Noah's flood. He speculated that when remains of animals fall into sediment underwater, the sediment may gradually harden. He noted that sudden changes in the height of land had taken place during earthquakes. These could easily reorient and shift layers. In 1668, Steno published his Prodromus, Introduction to a Dissertation on Solids Naturally Enclosed in Solids. In this work he asked, given a solid body enclosed by another, which became hard first? The first one to harden is the one that left the impression on the other. He also argued that objects that have their origin in living things may become petrified or have their shapes recorded in rock. The Prodromus presented Steno's three principles of strata. 1. Layers of strata have accumulated layer by layer and not all at once. First, the bottom layer is formed, then the one above it, etc. This is called the principle of superposition of strata. 2. The layers originally were horizontal or close to it. 3. A stratum forms a continuous solid layer when it is created. Steno made no strong statements about how much time was required for the solidification of fossils. He was not contradicting the conventional biblical timeline. The Prodromus was approved for publication by the church censors and published in Florence in 1668. Steno had converted to Catholicism in 1667, and after the Prodromus was published, his interests turned away from science and toward religion. He remarked that, quote, beautiful is that which we see, more beautiful that which we know, but by far the most beautiful that which we do not comprehend, unquote. Steno was ordained a Catholic priest in 1675, and his scientific work came to an end. An English translation of Steno's work came out soon after its publication in Florence, and it was immediately influential on British scientists. One of those in England who must have read Steno's work with interest was the multi-talented Robert Hooke, who had addressed some of the same issues in his Royal Society lectures and had arrived at similar conclusions. The title of Hooke's geology presentation was Lectures and Discourses of Earthquakes and Subterraneous Eruptions, Explicating the Causes of the Rugged and Uneven Face of the Earth, and what reasons may be given for the frequent finding of shells and other sea and land petrified substances scattered over the whole terrestrial superficies. Hooke pointed out evidence that water could create stony substances when operating very slowly over time. Stalactites form where water drops from the roofs of limestone caverns, and living corals build stony skeletons from seawater. Similarly, Hooke argued submerged things had become petrified to become the fossils we see today. By 1700, due primarily to the influence of Steno and Hooke, most natural philosophers accepted that fossils came from living organisms. Although both Steno and Hooke accepted the strict biblical chronology, both had taken initial steps that would eventually lead to its downfall. Thomas Burnet's Sacred Theory of the Earth. As the new science of the Earth started developing and becoming well known, numerous thinkers worked to integrate their new scientific knowledge with the Bible. One of the first significant attempts to develop a unifying theory, bringing together the Bible with recent earth science findings, came from Anglican priest Thomas Burnet, 1635 to 1715. In response to the Baconian injunction to keep the Bible separate from science, Burnet asserted, with unassailable logic, that, quote, "No truth concerning the natural world can be an enemy to religion, for truth cannot be an enemy to truth. God is not divided against himself." Unquote. Burnet's central concern was to relate the history of the earth with the biblical narrative, especially creation, the flood, and the Last Judgment. The biblical flood, he estimated, took place about 1,600 years after the creation of the earth around 4000 BC. From the Bible, he knew that the earth as originally created was perfect, and that it would come to a fiery end at some point in the future. He also accepted the widespread view that the earth was continually degenerating. Many held that since the flood was a miraculous event directly caused by God, then there was no point in trying to explain where the waters had come from or where they went after the flood ended. But Burnet had been impressed by the scientific revolution and its deep respect for the law of causality. He didn't like the idea that God simply created the water by a miracle and then annihilated it when he was done. Burnet wanted to explain the flood in scientific terms. He reasoned that even 40 days and nights of the heaviest torrent could not produce enough water for the flood, which covered the earth to a depth of 15 cubits, about 23 feet. So he asked, from where did the water come? Burnet proposed that the earth was initially perfectly spherical, without significant mountains and valleys, and that there were large reservoirs of water beneath the top crust of the earth. When the flood occurred, parts of the crust split, and rocks of the crust collapsed into the reservoirs, forcing the water up to the surface. When the flood ended, the water seeped back into gaps in the earth, but left the surface in the chaotic state we see today. Burnet published his Sacred Theory of the Earth in 1681 in Latin, and shortly after that in an English version. The full title was The Sacred Theory of the Earth, containing an account of the original of the earth and of the general changes which it has already undergone, or it is to undergo, till the consummation of all things. In 1692, Burnet published his Philosophical Archaeology, which tried to reconcile his theory of Genesis in greater detail, treating the biblical account of the fall of man as an allegory, not as literal truth. This led to accusation of blasphemy, and Burnet was forced to resign his position. Burnet's Sacred Theory of the Earth inspired many similar works, such as the 1696 book by Professor William Whiston, who would later succeed Isaac Newton as Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, titled A New Theory of the Earth, From Its Original to the Consummation of All Things, wherein the creation of the world in 6 days, the universal deluge, and the general conflagration, as laid down in the Holy Scriptures, are shown to be perfectly agreeable to reason and philosophy. In the early 18th century, a handful of thinkers on the continent, influenced by the philosopher René Descartes, were starting to consider much longer time frames for the age of the earth. Descartes had proposed a mechanistic view of the physical universe, in which the earth had formed from the material of an extinguished star. Descartes did not discuss the duration of the process, but he did not restrict himself to an account literally consistent with Genesis. A French diplomat and traveler named Benoit de Maillet was impressed by evidence suggesting that sea levels had been steadily decreasing over time. Some ancient inland cities must have surely been seaports in their day, but these were now far above sea level. At a more recent seaside fortress in Carthage, markings had indicated the initial water level are now 5 to 6 feet above sea level. De Maillet reasoned that the sea must be sinking about 3 inches per century. He argued that the diminution of the sea must have started at least 2 billion years ago. At some point in the distant past, according to de Maillet, the earth was covered by water. This water had been gradually evaporating and disappearing. Echoing Anaximander, he argued that all life rose in the sea and had gradually transformed into the living world we see today. De Maillet did not restrict himself to the biblical timescale or even attempt to reconcile his views with Genesis. He revised his book continually until shortly before his death in 1738. It was not published until 1748 as Telemed, or Conversations between an Indian Philosopher and a French Missionary on the Diminution of the Sea. The editor made many changes to make it less heretical, but it was still violently denounced. However, the book sold well, and an English translation was made in 1750. Another Frenchman who was open to a longer-than-biblical time scale was Georges Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, 1707 to 1788. Keeper of the Jardin du Roi for Louis XV and author of the multi-volume Histoire naturelle, générale et particulière. Most of this encyclopedic work was devoted to descriptions of existing plants and animals, but Buffon also presented his theories about geology. He discussed the processes of mountain building, sedimentation of river estuaries, erosion of coasts, the cooling of the earth, the formation of rocks and minerals, ocean and atmosphere, and the emergence of life, all as natural processes occurring over at least 100,000 years. Members of the Sorbonne's Faculty of Theology, who were representatives of the Catholic Church, denounced Buffon's work and sent him an official letter identifying a list of propositions, both philosophic and scientific, from the work that seemed reprehensible to them. The first 4 propositions involved his speculations on how the earth might have been formed from the sun. Buffon was forced to publish a statement that he never had, quote, any intention of contradicting the text of Scripture, unquote, and that he abandoned anything in his book that, quote, touches on the formation of the earth, and, in general, everything that might be contrary to the narrative of Moses, unquote. The Cartesians Benoit de Maillet and the Comte de Buffon had opened the door to the possibility of a genuinely ancient earth and the corresponding rejection of the literal Genesis account. Both had made intriguing observations, but their writings were still speculative, unconvincing, and easily dismissed by critics. The next major development was to come from the Scottish Enlightenment, in the person of a gentleman farmer named James Hutton, who would become acclaimed as the father of modern geology. James Hutton's Deist Geology. James Hutton was born in Edinburgh in 1726, son to a merchant and city treasurer. Hutton studied at the University of Edinburgh, where he developed an interest in chemistry. He also attended lectures on mathematics by Colin Maclaurin, an accomplished mathematician who had met and been deeply influenced by Isaac Newton, and who would go on to extend Newton's work in calculus, geometry, and gravitation. Maclaurin taught that this world is not the work of the devil or a decayed ruin of a more perfect past time, as was conventionally believed. Rather, he held that it is an orderly and benevolent place that reflects the generosity of God and the symmetry of his natural laws. His deism was a significant step away from traditional Christianity, in that deists accepted the moral guidance of the Bible, but rejected its literal interpretation as an accurate history of the world. God set the universal laws, but did not tinker with these laws once they were set. He definitely did not intervene in the world through miracles and floods. The deist philosophy would profoundly influence Hutton. Hutton received his medical degree from the University of Leiden. Having developed an avid interest in chemistry while back in Edinburgh, he started a business with a friend for manufacturing sal ammoniac from chimney soot. Sal ammoniac is a white salt that was used in dyeing and for working with brass and tin. After inheriting a farm in Scotland, he decided to become a farmer. He decided to learn all he could about different farming techniques, and this led him to explore much of England and the Low Countries of Europe. During this exploring, he became fascinated by the structure of the Earth's surface, and he started developing his own theory around 1760. In 1768, he retired from farming and moved to Edinburgh, where he further developed and tested his ideas. Hutton became so familiar with the geological structures and rocks of England that he would boast that he could tell where a piece of gravel had come from anywhere on the eastern side of Britain. A friend of Hutton owned and operated a small coal mine, and this gave Hutton more opportunities to study the structure of the rocks. Over his lifetime, Hutton amassed a huge collection of geological specimens, many collected by himself, and many more acquired from a network of like-minded associates. He also devoured travel books for any information about geology. Hutton noted that the most obvious type of geological change was erosion by water. All farmers knew the power of water to wash away soil, but Hutton could see that erosion affected rocks as well. At places on the coast, he saw the effects of waves on rock outcrops that faced the sea. He concluded that most valleys had been created by the erosion of streams. Hutton saw a pattern of destruction of the land, with rocks slowly decaying and disintegrating into pieces that comprise soil, which is later washed away by streams and rivers, eventually leading to the sea. If this process continued indefinitely, he reasoned, the continents would eventually be leveled and swept entirely into the sea. Belief in the degeneration of the land was relatively common in Hutton's time. Many earlier thinkers, such as Thomas Burnet, believed that the earth itself is in a state of decay, having been created initially in a perfect state, but having been affected by Adam's fall and Noah's flood. Now its surface is in a disordered and messy state. The idea of a decaying earth was not entirely consistent with Hutton's deist philosophy. God had created a finely tuned world machine for the sustenance of life, and this machine could not wear out, run down, or decay. Or if it did have elements that necessarily decay, it would also have inbuilt means of revitalization. The world must surely sustain itself. But how? Hutton saw indications that rocks had been created. He examined the small-scale structure of sedimentary rocks, such as sandstones, and compared this to the gravel and sand produced by erosion. They looked the same, except that in the rocks the particles had somehow been cemented together. As a farmer, Hutton was well aware of how farmers throughout southern England used chalk as a fertilizer. On close examination, chalk seemed to contain the bodies of sea animals. Hutton could see that erosion destroyed rock, unknown forces created rock, and within this process was created the soil necessary to support life. This was not explained by any existing geological theory. Hutton accepted the conclusions of Hooke and Steno about how rock layers had formed. But at the bottom of the sea, how could layers of sediment become hardened? In Edinburgh, Hutton became acquainted with chemist Joseph Black, whose experiments with quicklime demonstrated that heat and pressure could transform rocks in various ways. Hutton concluded that the layered rocks had been hardened by the combination of pressure from above layers, combined with heat from the earth. Since the layers were often found far from the seashore, either the sea had dropped or the land had been pushed up from below. In many places, the strata we see are nearly horizontal, but this is not the case through much of Scotland, where the strata can be found of almost any angle, clearly bent, and even turned over. Some tremendous pressures in the earth must have bent the strata, and if they could bend the strata, they could also raise the strata. Hutton was aware of signs of heat deep in the earth, such as volcanoes and hot springs. He had heard about earthquakes which had caused land masses to rise. At places on the coast, he saw indications that granite and basalt had been injected in a molten form into veins into previously existing strata. The inventor James Watt, a friend of Hutton, had shown that heat can do work. So, heat could conceivably cause land to rise. Hutton concluded that the surface of the earth had changed cyclically. Land was worn away into particles that were deposited into the sea in layers, which were then baked by the earth's heat and then pushed up into new land, and the cycle continued indefinitely. From this theory, Hutton predicted that there would be places where two different sets of strata, oriented in different directions, are in contact. After an extensive search, Hutton was able to find actual instances of these structures, which are called unconformities by modern geologists. These showed that the first set of strata were laid down in a sea, hardened, then lifted and deformed, and eroded, then submerged, and new strata were laid on top of that. This confirmed Hutton's idea of cycles of uplift and decline. So how old is the Earth? How fast are the processes of creation and decay of rocks? And how many times has this happened in the past? Hutton did not have answers to these questions. He did hold that the Earth must be extremely ancient. Consider how slow the erosion of rocks must be. Hutton knew that Hadrian's Wall across Britain was about 1,600 years old, yet parts of it were still in good condition. The process of decline was too slow to be measurable within the time scale of human history. Quote, "Every revolution of the globe wears away some part of some rock upon some coast, but the quantity of that decrease in that measured time is not a measurable thing. We are certain that in all the coasts of the present continents are wasted by the sea, and constantly wearing away upon the whole. But this operation is so extremely slow that we cannot find a measure of the quantity in order to form an estimate." Unquote. Hutton concluded his 1788 paper saying that, for the world, we can find, quote, "no vestige of a beginning, no trace of an end." Unquote. He did not mean that the earth is eternal, although many interpreted that to be his position. Hutton first publicly presented his views in 1785 in an address to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He later summarized his theory in a concise essay published in 1788 in the Transactions of the Royal Society. His work culminated in 1795 with his publication of the 2-volume Theory of the Earth with Proofs and Illustrations, which was over 1,000 pages in total, and written in a dense style that did not make it easy reading. The reaction to Hutton's theory was mixed. Some journal reviews were moderately positive, but many geologists simply ignored his theory, and others attacked it mercilessly. In their attacks, the dominant issue, though not always named explicitly, was the conflict with Genesis. Hutton's theory clashed with the dominant geological view known as Neptunism. Named after the Greek god of the sea, this theory had been propounded most strongly by lecturer Abraham Werner. Neptunists held that heat was an insignificant agent for the creation of rocks, and that virtually all rocks had been precipitated or crystallized out of a universal ocean. They asked Hutton's followers how the Earth could contain a virtually limitless source of heat, which seemed necessary for Hutton's theory. Neptunism could be much more easily reconciled with the Bible. Werner's ideas became prevalent in Europe in the late 18th century and also into the 19th. While Werner himself did not hold to the biblical chronology, many other Neptunists did. Richard Kirwan of Edinburgh, a respected chemist and geologist, explicitly attacked Hutton's theory on two grounds. It created an incomprehensible abyss of time, and it was contrary to Genesis. John Williams, the author of a 1789 book titled The Natural History of the Mineral Kingdom, devoted 40 pages to an attack on Hutton's theory, calling it a wild and unnatural notion that led to, quote, skepticism and at last to downright infidelity and atheism, unquote. Numerous churchmen also chimed in on the debate, and their opinions were as expected. In 1813, Reverend Joseph Townsend published his The Character of Moses Established for Veracity as an Historian, recording events from the creation to the deluge. Although Hutton's deism and his appeal to divine design arguments played a role in his reasoning, his primary sources were the many types of evidence he presented. His reasoning was, overall, dominantly empirical. His Theory of the Earth is one of the most influential books ever published in geology. His fame as the father of geology is deserved. He was the first to create a systematic and testable theory of the Earth that rejected any Bible-based reasoning. He had discovered deep time. Charles Lyell. After Hutton, the next giant of geology was another Scotsman. Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875, studied at Exeter College, Oxford, where classics and theology dominated the curriculum. Lyell attended the lectures on geology of the Reverend William Buckland, who contended that geology pointed to a divine deluge. Geology was becoming a popular and exciting subject, in which many were working to integrate the new scientific discoveries with Genesis. When Lyell read a book on Hutton's theory, he became convinced of its essential truth. He spent the rest of his life studying and writing about geology, traveling extensively through Europe, making countless observations, and reading works relevant to geology in numerous languages. Lyell was profoundly influenced by Hutton's theory, but unlike Hutton, Lyell did not rely on arguments from design. He emphasized three closely related issues of method. 1. As demonstrated by Newton's Principia, unchanging universal laws of nature are the key to understanding the world. 2. In geology, quote, the present is the key to the past, unquote. We should always attempt to explain past changes by reference to the processes that we see operating today. 3. We should generally assume that the intensity of geological processes of the past, including earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, etc., is similar to the intensity we observe in the present. Positing unobserved past catastrophes, such as a universal deluge, is too speculative to be scientific. Lyell's magnum opus was titled Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. It was published in London in 3 volumes between 1830 and 1833. The 1,400 pages of the text were rich with examples of geological forms and changes over time. His research made use of hundreds of sources in 5 modern European languages and 2 ancient ones. Most of the text was devoted to describing observed geological forces. Lyell carefully described the slow changes involved with rivers, tides, currents, and delta formation. He wrote about the effects of earthquakes and volcanoes, as well as geological changes resulting from plants and animals. He devoted long chapters to the description of fossils and the processes that must have created them. Lyell saw the Anglican Church as the main obstacle to a real science of geology. Most Anglicans were committed to a literal reading of Genesis. Lyell passionately desired to, quote, free the science from Moses, unquote, but he did not attack Genesis outright. Lyell reassured his conservative readers that geology was not anti-Bible or anti-Christian, and that Genesis was open to a less-than-literal reading. The first 6 days of Genesis were not necessarily 6 literal days, as even St. Augustine had accepted. They may have instead been 6 eras of unknown length. Geology, Lyell also assured his readers, did not challenge the biblical story of the origin of man. Lyell's Principles of Geology was widely read, discussed, and reviewed in Europe, America, and Australia. Lyell constantly revised his Principles of Geology to account for recent discoveries. When he died in 1875, he was busy revising the 12th edition. In early 19th century Britain, most people still weighed the literal truth of Scripture higher than science-based accounts. Books like Burnet's were popular through the first half of the century, but Lyell's books were profoundly influential, and by mid-19th century, most educated Englishmen had opened to the possibility that the Earth was indescribably old. The new geological conclusions still alarmed some, mainly clerics, but in general, these discoveries were not considered a major threat to religion. The most significant impact of Lyell's writings is evident in the writings of Charles Darwin, who took the first volume of The Principles of Geology along on his HMS Beagle voyage. Darwin wrote to his sister that before reading Lyell, he was ignorant of geology. Quote, as far as I know, everyone has yet thought that the 6,000-odd years of Ussher had been the right period. Unquote. Darwin's debt to Lyell and the earlier geologists such as Hutton is evident in Darwin's masterwork on the origin of species. Quote, it may be objected that time will not have sufficed for so great an amount of organic change, all changes having been effected very slowly through natural selection. He who can read Sir Charles Lyell's grand work on the Principles of Geology, which a future historian will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, yet does not admit how incomprehensibly vast have been the past periods of time, may at once close this volume. Unquote. In this chapter, we have seen how scientific observation and reasoning led thinkers to reject the biblical view of the Earth's history and to embrace the idea of deep time. The discovery of deep time eroded belief in the literal truth of the Bible and helped pave the way for Darwin's theory of evolution. Although earlier thinkers had argued for deep time, the single most important figure was James Hutton. This was a transition away from reliance on the Bible, a product of consciousness, as a source of knowledge. As such, it was a step away from the primacy of consciousness and towards the primacy of existence.